The continent with everything and anything the world needs. The continent that everybody is going to for their needs. But the continent that we, the children of Africa, are busy running away from. That keeps me up every night. The more I try to dig deeper in understanding as to why Africa is where Africa is today, I couldn't help but find myself repeatedly going back to the beginning to say, how did we end up where we are as Africans? How did we get here? Not only as black people, but as Africans. The colonizers started coming to Africa, starting with the Portuguese, followed with slavery. But by 1884, after they had been haphazardly going into our continent, looting from the Africans, pretty soon they started looting from each other the loot that they had looted from the Africans. And before you know it, they were killing each other. And they were getting ready to have a war, a European war on the African soil. So Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany at that time, called his sidekick Leopold, King Leopold of Belgium, said, listen, we got a problem. We're getting ready to kill each other and have a European war in Africa. Why don't we call all the colonizers? That was France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, and of course the mighty Britain. Let's all meet in Berlin, Germany, and strategize on how we can organize ourselves so we can effectively see to it that Africa and her children are forever defeated and dominated. Something that was just downright terrible. Made the African leaders sign what they call the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. Today, France is taking out of Africa, Francophone Africa, over $500 billion. Over $500 billion. We, the Africans, the poor countries, we're giving France over $500 billion a year in, year out. And
Dr. Arikana Chihombori-Quao served as the African Union's permanent representative to the United States from 2017 until her abrupt removal in 2019. Her tenure became one of the most controversial diplomatic episodes involving Africa and Western institutions in recent years. Not because of corruption, misconduct, or incompetence, but because of the content of her public speeches and interviews. Her removal followed a period in which she openly criticized Western policies toward Africa, foreign aid structures, debt dependency, resource extraction, and the long-term consequences of colonial economic systems. Dr. Arikana is a medical doctor by training, born in Zimbabwe and later becoming a U.S. citizen. She practiced obstetrics and gynecology in the United States for decades before entering diplomacy. Her appointment as ambassador to the United States was part of a broader effort by the African Union to strengthen its diplomatic voice in Washington and engage directly with U.S. policymakers, international institutions, and the African diaspora. Almost immediately after assuming the role, Dr. Arikana adopted a communication style that was unusually direct for a senior diplomat. Rather than limiting herself to closed-door meetings and carefully worded statements, she appeared frequently in public forums, universities, think tanks, diaspora events, and media interviews. In these appearances, she spoke bluntly about Africa's relationship with the West, often framing it as structurally unequal and historically exploitative. One of her central arguments was that Africa's underdevelopment was not accidental, but the result of deliberate systems created during colonialism and maintained through modern economic arrangements. She frequently stated that colonial powers did not simply extract resources and leave, but designed post-independence institutions that kept African nations dependent on foreign capital, foreign currencies, and foreign approval. According to her, aid dependency replaced direct colonial rule, creating what she described as modern-day economic enslavement. Dr. Arikana publicly criticized the role of international financial institutions, arguing that loans and aid packages often came with conditions that weakened African sovereignty. She questioned why African countries rich in minerals, oil, and agricultural potential remained poor while multinational corporations and foreign governments continued to profit from African resources. She emphasized that Africa exported raw materials cheaply and imported finished products at high cost, locking the continent into a cycle of dependency. One of her most widely circulated speeches focused on foreign aid. She argued that aid had failed Africa, not because Africans were incapable of development, but because aid was structured to benefit donor countries more than recipients. She stated that aid money frequently returned to donor nations through consulting contracts, procurement requirements, and foreign experts, while African economies remained stagnant. She challenged African leaders to stop begging and start negotiating. Her comments also addressed military presence in Africa. She questioned the long-term benefits of foreign military bases on African soil and asked why decades of security cooperation had not translated into lasting peace or stability in regions affected by conflict. She suggested that instability often served external interests tied to arms sales, resource access, and geopolitical leverage. These statements were welcomed by many Africans and members of the African diaspora, who saw her as articulating long-suppressed frustrations. Videos of her speeches spread widely on social media platforms, particularly among young Africans. She became a symbol of assertive African diplomacy, someone willing to speak uncomfortable truths in Western spaces. However, her outspokenness also generated tension within diplomatic circles. Some African governments reportedly expressed discomfort, arguing that her comments were too confrontational and risked straining relations with key partners. Diplomacy traditionally emphasizes consensus, subtlety, and collective messaging, while Dr. Arikana's style emphasized moral clarity and public accountability. The turning point came in 2019, when reports emerged that the African Union had recalled her from her post. Initially, the recall was described as routine, but it quickly became clear that her removal was connected to her public statements. AU officials stated that her comments did not reflect the official position of the organization and emphasized that ambassadors must speak within agreed frameworks. Dr. Arikana herself stated publicly that she was not informed of any misconduct or formal complaint prior to her dismissal. She maintained that she was removed because she spoke openly about issues many preferred to keep quiet. She argued that the truth she presented threatened entrenched interests benefiting from Africa's dependency. The African Union later clarified that ambassadors are expected to adhere strictly to official policy positions and diplomatic protocols. From the AU's perspective, her statements crossed the line between personal opinion and institutional representation. Critics of the decision argued that this explanation ignored the broader context of external pressure and internal discomfort with her message. Western media coverage of her removal was relatively muted, focusing largely on procedural explanations rather than the substance of her speeches. In contrast, African and diaspora media framed the event as an example of silencing a critical African voice. The disparity in coverage fueled further debate about whose narratives dominate global discourse. After her dismissal, Dr. Arikana became even more vocal. She continued to speak at international forums, universities, and online platforms, no longer constrained by diplomatic protocol. She expanded her critique to include African leadership, arguing that corruption, fear, and self-interest among some African elites allowed exploitative systems to persist. She emphasized that Africa's future depended on unity, industrialization, value addition, and control of its resources. She advocated for inter-African trade, regional manufacturing, and strategic partnerships based on mutual benefit rather than dependency. She urged Africans to rethink relationships with Western governments, China, and other global powers through a lens of sovereignty and long-term interest. Her supporters argued that her firing exposed a fundamental contradiction in international relations, that free speech is celebrated until it challenges powerful economic and political structures. They see her case as evidence that African voices are tolerated only when they align with existing power dynamics. Her critics counter that diplomacy requires discipline and that personal activism cannot replace institutional consensus. They argued that her approach risked isolating Africa diplomatically and undermining ongoing negotiations. From this perspective, her removal was about governance, not censorship. The debate surrounding Dr. Arikana's dismissal highlights a deeper struggle over Africa's place in the global order. It raises questions about who gets to define Africa's narrative, how much autonomy African diplomats truly possess, and whether institutions built to represent Africa are willing to confront uncomfortable truths. Years after her removal, her speeches continued to circulate widely, often reaching larger audiences than during her time as ambassador. Her case is frequently cited in discussions about neocolonialism, aid dependency, and the limits of acceptable discourse within international institutions. The episode also reflects generational shifts within Africa and the diaspora. Younger Africans increasingly demand transparency, accountability, and assertiveness from their leaders and representatives. They are less willing to accept diplomatic language that masks structural inequality and exploitation. Dr. Arikana's removal did not silence her message. Instead, it amplified it. What began as a diplomatic appointment evolved into a global conversation about power, truth, and the cost of speaking openly in international politics. Whether viewed as a necessary disciplinary action or a politically motivated dismissal, her firing remains a defining moment in modern African diplomacy. The story of Dr. Arikana is ultimately about boundaries, the boundary between diplomacy and activism, between institutional loyalty and moral conviction, and between acceptable critique and forbidden truth. It illustrates how power responds when narratives challenge the foundations on which global systems are built. Her case continues to resonate because it forces a fundamental question. If Africa's representatives cannot speak honestly about Africa's challenges and history in global forums, then who can?
You've been watching Echoes of Africa, where every story carries the sound of tomorrow. If this moved you, subscribe now, like, and share so Africa's voice never fades into silence.